Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, State of Trade, Pandemic-Pressurized Trade Policy. This is the May event for the State of Trade webinar series, which is a monthly series of experts offering timely insights into the rapidly changing world of international trade. Before we get started, let's cover a few housekeeping items. The tour of your screen. So on your screen, you can see multiple application widgets that you can use. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. You will find a copy of today's slide deck in the additional materials on the bottom left. In this section, you'll also find some of our guests' work from Global Trade Alert, an independent commercial policy monitoring initiative. We'll talk more about that coming right up. And you can find a Forbes article that I just wrote, Spain, Steel, and a Tricky Trade Truce. Getting to what's going on with protection between the U.S. and the EU, also timely. I would also invite you to join us next week on May 25th for a Logistics Rewired update, What's Next in Ocean webinar. And you'll find a link to this on the top right. If you are inspired to ask questions, and we hope you are, please ask them through the Q&A widget on the right. We don't promise, but time permitting, we will try to answer as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. We also invite you to share with us other webinar topics that you'd like to explore or any comments you'd like to offer about the program. Our goal is to share valuable insights, and you can find a quick survey on the bottom right. Lastly, let me note that an on-demand version of the webinar will be available shortly after the webinar and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Okay. And now the part that keeps our lawyers happy. Please do keep in mind that all information provided in this webinar is presented based on the situation at the time and may not be customized to your specific situation. And on with the show. I'm Phil Levy, I'm Chief Economist at Flexport, and I'm very pleased to have with me Simon Evenet, who is Professor of International Trade and Economic Development at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. Simon is someone I have known and enjoyed working with for a very long time. Simon, I think it's getting on about 27 years now, which is a little bit scary. We first encountered when Simon was completing his doctoral work at Yale University. He's gone on to do many, many impressive things, and with a particularly impressive track record of relevance, which is not always the case in academic trade. But he founded the Global Trade Alert, which is an independent monitoring service, and we'll talk a great deal about what they've done. They've monitored trade and investment policies that affect supply chains and essential goods. And he's weighed in on really a whole bunch of relevant topics. So, Simon, wonderful to have you here with us.
Hi, Phil. Great to be here.
All right, so we're going to tap into Simon's expertise in just a second to give you an idea of what we will be talking about and where we're going. We're going to talk a little bit to begin with on, we've got this sort of broader question. If you want to take an overarching theme, it's what has been happening to trade protection in the global economy in recent years? Is this a pandemic phenomenon, or is the pandemic a continuation of a phenomenon that was already going on? And what is that phenomenon anyways? So this is going to lead us to talk about things like scaling and measuring protectionism. What do we mean by this? How would you know it if you saw it? You clearly know as a business if you're paying a tariff at the border, but are there other versions of this, and what's happening for restrictions on trade? We will talk a bit about response to crisis, which will give us an occasion to compare what we've been seeing most recently with the pandemic crisis with the most salient recent comparison, which was what happened after the global financial crisis earlier. We will talk a bit about some of the particular sectors, and one in particular that's been prominent, which is what's happened with vaccines, health, intellectual property protection. And then, as is our want, we will come to where is this all taking us? What's on the cutting edge? And as a little foreshadowing, we'll be talking a bit about things digital, where there has been a great deal of activity. So with all of that to cover, let's jump in and let's first talk about scaling and measuring protectionism. And before we start opining on all of this, I'm going to invite all of you to register your opinion, and we'll take that as our starting point. So let me ask you, this is going to be one of several polls that we will conduct. So I'll ask you all to weigh in. And the question we're posing is the amount of global protectionism, by which we mean policy barriers to trade in recent years. And here's how you can characterize that. You could say it has stayed pretty level, though there may have been shifts from one sector to another. You could say it increased early in the Trump administration, and the pandemic was just a continuation of that. You could say, no, it really increased in response to the pandemic. So the difference between 2 and 3 is more of a timing issue. You could say it's not as bad as people say. So an optimistic outlook. And you could say it's hard to measure, which is a sophisticated way of saying that you're not sure. So let me ask you to weigh in. There's no particularly wrong answer, but it'll give us a starting point. It's nice to know what your experience has been, what you think, and then we'll give our opinions and take it from there, and then talk about how one might sort of come up with a more systematic measure. So again, the amount of global protection, policy barriers to trade in recent years, stayed level, increased from early on in the Trump administration, increased more recently just in response to the pandemic, is not as bad as people say, or is hard to measure. I'm not sure. All right. Thank you to those of you who have voted. We're getting some nice returns in. I'm going to give you just a moment or two more to register your opinion, and then we'll show you what everyone says. So going once, going twice, survey says... Interesting. So by far, a very, very strong majority say that the pandemic has not really been the break point. It was 9.2% who said it really increased in response to the pandemic. 72.4% said that we saw the increase in global protectionism early on in the Trump administration, and what we've seen lately is just a continuation of that. Simon, where would you weigh in on this? I'm going to let you use all your data too, so this is a segue to that. But if you had to vote on this, what would you have voted?
I would have voted perhaps differently, because in my view, and from what I've seen in the data, the protectionist buildup actually started even before Trump. And Trump
it was a trick question, unintentionally.
That's okay, don't worry. So what I think we can show you in the data, and I think Phil's has pulled it up now, is essentially a build-up in the resort to all sorts of trade distortions and trade protectionism since 2009. And you see an increase in both the number of new protectionist measures introduced every year. By the way, you also see an increase in the number of trade reforms too. So there's kind of a schizophrenic policy dimension going on here. And also you see in terms of the amount of world trade affected, protectionism covers well over 70% now of world trade, compared to half that total for trade reforms. So I would argue the build-up happened beforehand. This, by the way, Phil, has one really interesting implication, which is that I think almost all of us who like the trading system are reluctant to admit that Donald Trump was right about anything. But he was right to point out that before he came into office, there was growing protectionism. I don't think he ever looked at the numbers. But he asserted this, and in this case, he actually wasn't wrong. And what it did was it put many people who supported the trading system in a difficult position, because when you look at the facts, there was protectionism. And Trump's question to everyone is, well, what are you doing about it? His solution, of course, was exactly wrong. I wouldn't support it. But he was right to highlight that there was this build-up beforehand.
So let's see how we reconcile this with people's preconceptions, because it's not hard to tell where the preconceptions are coming from. If you were importing goods from China, for example, you saw relatively low tariff levels. You might have seen anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties on certain products, but relatively low. And then all of a sudden we got this sequence from a U.S. perspective of Section 232 with steel and aluminum, the Section 301. And so it seemed like that was a pretty clear break point where one saw protection shoot up. Your measures are not straight tariffs into the U.S. So let's talk about the differences. What is the difference in terms of these counts versus what one might look at as how much tariffs am I paying to bring something into the U.S.?
Great. So this is a great question. It comes to one of the key things, or key messages here, which is that protectionism differs in its level of salience. So when a country puts in place high tariffs on imports from other countries and does so very publicly, and President Trump did do it very publicly, I am not surprised that many of our viewers and our participants, they registered that and said, hey, something has changed. But I would also urge you to think that there are lots of trade distortions which go under the radar screen. And many of them are subsidy related, where governments may give their exporters a help to essentially steal market share from others in third markets, or where governments bail out import competing firms at home, or where governments use public procurement devices like Buy America to direct sales towards domestic firms. There's a whole range of much less high-profile forms of trade distortion, which governments were using before Donald Trump got elected. And often, by the way, a lot of those interventions involved a much smaller scale. So the charts that I had shown you before were ones which accumulate up thousands and thousands of pieces of protectionism. It's almost like death by 1,000 cuts. Whereas what Trump did was to get out a huge bazooka and fire it at a foreign trading partner. So the big distinction is salience, is definitely salience in this. And I can fully understand why many people would say that something materially changed under Trump. But what changed was not going from free trade to protectionism. What changed was going from murky protectionism to in-your-face explicit protectionism.
That's interesting. So let's take a moment more on these charts. One of the striking things about these is, as you noted, you're not just showing a measure of protectionism, which I think here is the new trade distortions or trade distortions total. One is the change, I guess, one is the accumulation, but that you have reforms at the same time. Is it your sense that this is, countries stepping on the brake and the gas at the same time? Is it different sectors, or is it different countries? Because this is a global measure, right?
Yeah, so the chart that you're showing is one where it's the global totals. And within the global totals, we do have different countries going on different trajectories. So you have countries like the US under Trump going in one direction. If you looked at something like the EU, you would have a more mixed picture where there's a lot less explicit protectionism and more subsidies. In terms of reformers, and this is to pick up on your point about trade reforms there, we do see quite a lot of tariff cuts in some of the more progressive thinking emerging markets who cut their tariffs. They're still cutting their tariffs and integrating. So I think that's what's being picked up in the green lines and charts which are showing you there. But I mean, we should be fair. The EU and the US have from time to time cut tariffs, and by the way, so has China on some goods as well. So this has been there, but it's just never as salient as the tariff increases.
Now, so a last question before we sort of move on to some of the other stuff. How do you talked about, a bazooka versus sort of smaller measures. How do we think of relative magnitudes? And I'll note, this has been a problem that has plagued trade people for a very long time, because some of the things that one might think of as really obvious measures have lots of flaws. So you and I know very well, if you just looked at, say, what's the average tariff rate, well, you might have high tariffs on goods that aren't traded very much and low tariffs on goods that are. That can be misleading. Sometimes it could be if you look at tariff revenue. Well, if you have tariffs that are so high that it blocks trade, you get no revenue. And so you'll get a misleading measure. So it's a very interesting thing to have this count thing when you are trying to assess for yourself, what is the magnitude? How do you reconcile all of this?
So this is a great question. You have to separate out, I think, at least three things. So first is the sort of frequency of interventions. And the left-hand chart I have there is one which counts what's the frequency of new intervention. And you might say, well, look, I mean, frequency tells you nothing about the amount of trade involved and the height of the trade barrier and the like. And this is fair comment. But I should add that all the international institutions who track this use counts too. So this is, I put that there largely for comparability from their work. I prefer what's on the right-hand side, which is trade coverage. So how much trade is covered or potentially affected by different types of policy interventions. So that gives you a better sense of scale, but it tells you nothing about the height of the trade barriers, which is the point that you want to make. And that is trying to come up with some aggregate measure of that has bedeviled researchers for at least 30 years from what I can remember. So we have no clean way of aggregating up across all the different types of trade distortions in a way that makes sense. I think the cleanest thing that we have, which we can explain, are shares of exports or imports affected, and that's what's shown on the right-hand chart for you there. But that comes with caveats too. So it could be the case that we have 70-odd% of world trade affected by at least one trade barrier, but 20% is affected by one trade barrier and 40 or 50% is affected by 5. I mean, so there's the differences in intensity of hits doesn't come through in a chart like that as well. So we have a problem summarizing this overall dynamic. But I would argue, I'd say, for all practical purposes, let's not make the perfect the enemy of the very good. And I think the charts all show here that things are getting worse faster than they're getting better. Yeah,
and so right. So the lesson tends to be we're not going to have a simple summary statistic that takes care of all of it. You take the sort of the totality of the evidence, and you take several different cuts at it, of which this is a very, very useful one. I wanted to you had mentioned subsidies. Why should we think of subsidies in the same way? Maybe this gets to what you're thinking of as distortion. So where our norm might be to think about the extent to which someone is putting on border measures to block trade. Why are you including subsidies as a measure of distortions the same way?
Right. So, and it really goes to this fundamental distinction between trade barriers and trade distortions. And trade barriers are typically associated, as you said, with import to restrictions, tariffs, quotas, and the like. And that's the classic textbook way of thinking about protectionism. And the reason, of course, it's rooted in how so many of us come at this is because that was a large part of the story in the 1930s when we had a massive protectionist breakout. And in fact, if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, the Cambridge English Dictionary, the definitions of protectionism, it's all in terms of trade restrictions or import restrictions. And so I understand why that's where many people come at this. But real-world experience tells us that there are other policy interventions that matter. So if you're a competitive farmer from Iowa trying to compete in an overseas market against a subsidized foreign rival and you're losing market share, you care about the subsidization being offered by that by rival's government. And so for a long time in agricultural trade, it's long been understood that subsidies were a problem. And so we should therefore try and calculate the share of world trade which is distorted by subsidies. And in this chart, as I show you on the right-hand side, we can see the growing shares of world trade which are influenced by subsidies to import competing firms or subsidies to exporters. So these are two reasons. Now, over time, of course, and to bring this discussion up to date, we worry about subsidies not just in agriculture, but increasingly in sectors like steel, semiconductors, and the like. There's been a big discussion about whether subsidization, in particular in China, is thought to have created excess capacity in world markets. And anyone who's interested in that discussion is focusing much more on the subsidy trade distortions than on import restrictions like tariffs. And so that's another reason why we take this seriously.
Well, yeah, which is an excellent point. And I like the way you drew the connection to some of those things where one can lead very much to the other. That if you looked just this very week at the announcement that was put out by the U.S. and the European Union, which have an ongoing trade war of the traditional sort, where they're sticking tariffs on each other, when they start to explain, here's why we needed to have this sort of a tariff war, it exactly gets back to the subsidies. And in their case, they're talking about excess capacity in steel and frequently alleging that China is at the core of this. But you're right. So this, whether in its own right or as a precursor to the other barriers, this seems a sort of very useful measure of what's going on. All right, let's go on and talk a little bit about the crisis. And I wanted to sort of refresh people, so now we have these measures in mind where you're claiming and offering evidence that this was a sort of buildup that was taking place for well over a decade now in terms of protection. If you look at the optics, as they say it, the sort of the public pronouncements, and you want to compare what happened with the global financial crisis, 2008 into 2009, depending whether you're talking about the reaction or the market breakdown, which go back to 2007, but let's that earlier global financial crisis and compare that to what we've dealt with the pandemic, the rhetoric has been dramatically different. And what I pulled out here, usually there's no sure way to lose an audience than to read a communique out loud, but I'll risk it. Just to sort of note the sort of different language at the time. This is a section of this London communique talking about resisting protectionism and promoting global trade and investment. And it sings the praises of trade. Trade growth has underpinned rising prosperity for half a century. It's now falling for the first time in 25 years. Protectionist pressure is a concern. We will not repeat the historic mistakes of protectionism in previous eras. We reaffirm the commitment to not raise barriers. We stand by the WTO. We'll promptly rectify whatever needs rectifying. That's not really what we've been hearing in the last year or so. We didn't have any great, post-pandemic G20 conferences where everyone forswore this sort of thing. What do you make of this rhetoric? I mean, are the lessons of the 30s not the same? Have they faded over the last decade or so? And does the rhetoric even matter? Is it people, was this an example of them saying one thing and doing another?
So, Phil, ultimately, the answer is yes. The governments made these declarations in 2009 and 10, saying, especially the G20 countries, saying they wouldn't do protectionism. And then they went ahead and did it. And that then created a real tension because there were countries, free trading members of the G20, who were very nervous about this. And in fact, by 2012, the Mexicans who were hosting the G20 then, they actually got a line in their communique that year saying, we are worried about the rising instances of protectionism. Well, that wouldn't have happened if everyone had followed what they said they were going to do in 2009 and 2010. So it became clearer over time that this was an embarrassment, that this so-called protectionist pledge was being honored more in the breach, as we say in English. Right? It was not being taken seriously. And we, of course, have been monitoring protectionism by the G20 right from the start. And our reports then became largely the record which showed how much governments were breaking this pledge. Now, for those of us who supported the World Trading System, this was a real problem because I think many of us wanted to believe that the system would hold the line against protectionism, but it didn't. And so there was essentially this tussle over time between the sort of realists versus the idealists on this, saying, look, when do we admit that the system hasn't worked? Now, in many ways, that tussle came to an end with the election of the Trump administration, because when the Trump administration came in, they went to these G20 meetings and they just made it clear they didn't support this no protectionism pledge. They didn't think other people were supporting it. And the reason you didn't see similar pledges being made quite so prominently in the pandemic was that the American delegations basically vetoed any such statements. And so I think, again, it's a little bit of an irony for people like me who support the trading system. Trump injected a degree of truth into this, or at least reality check. Let's just put it that way. His people injected some reality check, and this time around, countries the G20 decided not to make such a high-profile set of statements about this, and I think they probably regard that was a smart thing to do. Now, you have a slide here. You're showing, I believe, the slide.
You're going to show us data about what they actually did, with or without pledges.
Yes, that's exactly right. So the slide that you are showing now for the audience, let me just explain that. So this shows you the frequency with which each G20 member intervened last year, in 2020, in markets. And the red part shows you how often they resorted to protectionism, and the green part shows you how much they resorted to liberalization. And you can see a huge variation across countries. And the team I have, we worked really hard to try and check every single country. And we think these levels of intensity are pretty accurate. You did have countries like Mexico who really held back in doing both liberalization and protectionism. And then you had countries like the US and the UK and Germany, which actually offered huge numbers of subsidies last year. And that's what's been building up. So you see a big difference across countries in how much they resorted to protectionism. And if we can go to the next slide, Phil, this will just round out.
I want to hit you on something before we go to the next slide.
Yeah, for sure. Go for it.
Not to interrupt your momentum, but when you and I were starting out in this business, received wisdom would have been that developed countries had more or less forsworn protectionism, and developing countries were the ones who still indulged. If I look at some of the names, and I haven't done a correlation here, but sort of roughly, that does not seem to be the story of this chart.
No, it's not.
What do you sense as that pattern? Is this just simply the story that we weren't measuring things correctly? That developed countries have gone on to different things which only show up in the more comprehensive measures that you do, and they just weren't doing standard tariffs as much? How do we think about that?
So your last point's the right one, which is that when you and I started off in this business, that the presumption was, or the assumption was, that developing countries had more space to impose higher tariffs, and did, and industrialized countries were more constrained, and they were under their WTO obligations. And so we focused again on those salient trade policy instruments, and the ones which, by the way, were measured quite well. So that, it wasn't a completely outrageous thing to make this assumption, because the best data we had was on tariffs, and those tariffs bore out the conclusion that you mentioned. What, of course, wasn't being measured very well was all the other types of trade barriers and the subsidies which were being issued. And then once you bring those into the mix, you get a very different story. And you do get some developing countries who are intervening a lot and protectionists are using lots of protectionist measures, and you get some industrialized countries which are doing it. I think the real takeaway from this slide, from this chart, though, is that governments have a choice. They really have a choice. And so we should not default to say that governments always resort to lots of protectionism during crises, because some G20 countries clearly didn't do that. And we shouldn't assume that certain types of G20 countries always do protectionism or don't. Ultimately, governments have a choice. And I think what the job of people like me and others is to try and persuade governments to think of options which don't involve so much protectionism.
All right, great answer. Now I'll let you have your next slide.
Right, okay, this then gives you exactly what you teed us up for earlier, the comparison between what countries did in 2009 versus this time round. And so if every country had resorted to protectionism to the same degree in the two crises, then all of the points should be on the 45-degree line. We shouldn't see any dispersion around this. And in fact, what we actually do see is some interesting changes over time. So there are some countries like South Africa, which in 2009 liberalized more than they actually restricted trade. Whereas, and you had some countries like the United States, which was the other way around, and their positions flip with respect to this particular pandemic, or rather last year's pandemic response. And so what we have seen again is that not only did countries have a choice in 2009, they had a choice this last year, and often they chose differently. And I think that then should make us ask the question, okay, can countries fight a pandemic effectively, fight the economic downturn without disrupting international trade that much? In other words, can we get the economy back on its feet? Can we get people back to work? Can we keep people health and safety without screwing up the trading system? And I would suggest the fact that so many countries have responded in different ways suggests that there are probably better approaches for tackling pandemics and the economic fallout than others when it comes to the impact on the trading system.
So this is a very interesting chart. I want to make sure I understand it right. So this is about negative spillover. So doing something that has an ill effect on a trading partner. And if I understand this right, being below the line meant that you were better behaved in 2020 than you were in 2009. Is that correct? So the U.S. was better behaved in 2020 than it was in 2009?
Yes.
I'm going to send you a Make America Great Again hat, Simon. But okay, you can wear it proudly around Switzerland. That'll be fun. So no, that's interesting. But it's an interesting measure. How do you know if it's having a negative spillover effect?
So what we will do is for each policy intervention that we record, we ask, okay, if it's affecting trade, do we know of any foreign trading country partners who are exporting the good which is being subject to some type of import restriction or subsidy? So if the US raises tariffs on imported steel, of a certain type of imported steel, then we'll check to see if there are any countries which were already exporting that steel to the US, and then we'll say there's a negative spillover based on that. So we look literally measure by measure at whether or not there's a harmed trading partner, and if so, that's what counts towards this statistic. That's
very, very interesting. All right, let's see what else you have for us. How much these policies lasted. What do we make of this?
So this is where your G20 angle comes back in, because last year the G20 didn't trumpet that we're not going to do protectionism. They had a more subtle message. They said, if we find ourselves having to restrict trade, we'll promise to do it temporarily. In other words, we'll unwind it when we need to. So what we did in our last report was to check across the G20 how many countries had unwound their protectionism that they put in place by October 31st of 2020. This report came out in November of last year. So we asked, okay, by the time you got to October, how many countries had unwound some of the protectionism they put in place earlier in the year? And this blew my mind, because it turns out that countries like China and Russia had much more temporary protectionism than European countries, Canada, and the United States. And that's what surprised us. So it turns out that the countries that we would not normally associate with good behavior had actually put in place many more time-limited trade distortions, whereas other countries did not. Again, it highlights the fact that countries really have a choice, and we should be encouraging countries, if they are going to resort to trade distortions, and we wish they wouldn't, to use time-limited ones. And this type of chart highlights that there's real diversity across the G20 in terms of their fealty to the last year's G20 pledge.
Also, another interesting example of where you're using evidence to contradict what had been sort of preconceptions, certainly from when you and I, the dark ages, when you and I started out in all this, where the thought had been once protection came on, it developed a constituency, and the idea of temporary protection was something of a ruse. That unless it was sort of explicitly put in by law, where it was, a 3-year measure of a safeguard or something like that, you were unlikely to see a retreat. But as you say, this empirical evidence that there is at least that option, and that it is doable in some settings. And
maybe I just to add one point there, which is that it might be the case that the traditional view that you and I were brought up on is true for democracies, but for autocratic governments, they can put in place more temporary protectionism because they have less pushback from producer interests in removing it. I haven't thought of that much, but it does seem, as we were talking about this, that the more autocratic governments are the ones which have used temporary protectionism more last year.
There you go, a political economy paper for someone out there. Topic dear to my heart. All right, so let's see what else we've got. Some governments' responses facilitated trade, some didn't. So this is getting to how you had your red and your green before. What do we make of this?
So I think, are you still on slide number 14, Phil? Or were you
no, I think it's on to 15 now. The one showing the buildup of new trade policies.
Right,
in force.
Exactly. So that's what I wanted to check, so I didn't get this wrong. So this slide number 15 that you're showing now is one which shows how quickly governments responded to the beginning of the pandemic by introducing either trade reforms or export curbs in the area of medical goods. And what we can see in the left-hand chart is that as we go through 2020, when we get into April, by the time we get to April, we have nearly 200 policy interventions which free up trade in medical goods last year. And this makes perfect sense, right? You do not want to be taxing imports of soap during a pandemic when we're all supposed to be washing our hands. And just so you know, I mean, last year, before the pandemic hit, 141 countries taxed the importation of soap. And 79 of them put import taxes of 15% or more on that imported soap. And a lot of countries took one look at this and said, what? This is nuts. So we've got to get rid of those tariffs. And so they did. They started reducing tariffs on quite a number of medical goods, not just the ones associated with COVID-19. So that's the good news story. The bad news story. We could have had something like 1840s Britain. It could have been like the Free Soap League. And
exactly. It could have been a massive move towards protectionism. I guess we just missed the right prime minister to carry it through.
We did. And of course, again, it goes to salience, right? So this was happening, these import tariff cuts and reducing sales taxes on soap and things like this. This was happening around the world. We were tracking it, but this is not what got the attention. What got the attention is the second highest line in this chart, which is the resort by governments to export curbs on things like masks, on personal protective equipment, on medical equipment like ventilators. And these export curbs, which surged too, but in the early part of 2020, this got a huge amount of attention because it disrupted industry supply chains and it caused a huge amount of pushback from internationally active companies whose plans for shipping all these different goods around the world were disrupted. And of course, some governments said, well, look, if the goods are in our country, we need to keep the masks for our people. What they didn't realize is, of course, that the moment they did this, they subjected themselves potentially to retaliation from other countries who could hold up shipments as well. And of course, for people operating supply chains, this was an absolute nightmare. And I must say, to government's credit, by the time we get to the end of Q2, a lot of these curbs are starting to be withdrawn. But as you can see from that chart, that even as we project out towards the end of this year, based on known phase-out dates of these export curbs, we're still going to have a large number of these export curbs in place. And so I think the trade flows in the medical goods sector will be permanently scarred by this. And by the way, they'll be permanently altered also by some of the tariff reductions, some of which are expected to stick as well. And so it's a great example of how a short-term outburst of both protectionism and liberalization can have permanent consequences for trade in the sector. And of course, this is going to have implications for where firms invest. So, and just to make this very tangible, the governments of Canada, Australia and Japan, all G20 members, did not choose to impose export curbs on any medical equipment last year. And the government, the Australians in particular, made it very clear that they would not stop shipments from any manufactured good of this type from Australia. And so if you are thinking about where do you want to locate production facilities to ship either to a region or around the world, the countries which resisted the temptation to do export curbs last year should be ones who have got a credible story for firms making FDI decisions. Come to our country because your supply chain won't be screwed up. And it will be interesting to see if companies respond to that track record.
That is an interesting point. And a good thing for those who are listening is to sort of look at not what they say, but what did they do. And you've also teed us up very nicely because we want to jump into this sector a little bit. It's been very salient thing about health, but it's time to check with the audience again. So all of you get ready to opine. As we move to discussing things about health and health-related goods, here's our question. When it comes to thinking about protection and trade in vaccines and health-related goods, do you believe that, first, the same principles apply as for any other goods, or it's not the same as for other goods, it matters more whether we can trust trading partners? Alternatively, it's not the same as for other goods, countries have better arguments for being self-sufficient. Or finally, it's more important to keep barriers low so we have access to key materials from abroad. So really, the question is about how do you think about protection in vaccines and health-related goods? Should it be the same as anything else? Should it be with a more restrictive group of partners? those that you can trust more? And these are certainly arguments that have been made. Should it be different from other goods, but with a tilt towards more protectionism? There's more of an argument for being self-sufficient and trying to do things domestically. Or does it all push in the other direction and say, this is an important sector, it's even more important to keep barriers low, so let's double down. We've got to make sure we have access to key materials from abroad. All right, we've got some good votes in. Some more of you need to make up your minds, or we beseech you humbly to make up your minds and tell us your opinion, and then we will go on to a discussion of what has been happening with vaccines and health-related goods. Not necessarily answering the question of what should happen. That one we're leaving up to you, but we want to find out where you stand. All right, so we've got some good replies, waiting for a few more. How do you think? In what way is the health and vaccine sector the same, different from others? And, does it matter whether it's with trusted trading partners, or is this a sort of more general argument? All right. Elves are tallying the votes in the back room. Actually, you can see the back room. There's no elves, and the cats are shut out. But going once, going twice, here is what you all think. So there may be a selection bias here for having a enlightened pro-trade audience, but we have 53.5% saying that it's more important to keep barriers low. Interestingly, very few said it's really the same. These goods are the same as any other goods. That this was something which sort of pushed people to take a stand. So it almost came down to an even split, slight edge to sort of keeping barriers low, but then there's a divide amongst, really the second and third answers are different variants of why you might be more restrictive. One says, be selective with upon whom you're relying, and the other one says, nah, it's just you need to be more self-sufficient. Does this surprise you, Simon?
Actually, the way I see a certain sort of unity in the arguments, I mean, I would, of course, align with the last argument, which is that I'd want to keep barriers low so that we can keep these supply chains going. But that is all presupposes trusting that those goods will end up being delivered. And, of course, that means trusting that other governments are not going to put in place export barriers. So I can see how some people say trust really matters. That is right. And anyone who wants to operate a complex supply chain implicitly is making assumptions about how trustworthy governments are in terms of export curbs. But I also, if I'm very pro-supply chain, I do want to keep markets open and barriers down as well. So I think trust is an important part of the story, as well as, of course, keeping the barriers down. And the absence of trust is, of course, what triggers the barriers increasing. And to put it in very tangible terms, suppose we want to persuade a country like Ethiopia not to raise import barriers on all sorts of medical goods and become self-sufficient. Well, the people in Ethiopia are going to say, look, well, we'll only do that. We can only afford to do that and source from abroad if we believe that when we need those medical goods, they're going to be delivered and there won't be export curbs. So in other words, if the Ethiopians don't trust the trading partners to deliver, they don't trust that export bans will be issued, then they're going to say we need to have our own domestic industry. So I see quite an interesting a link between the barrier argument and the trust argument. And your audience may well have been coming at this problem at the same perspective from two slightly different angles. But I think trust is a prerequisite for supporting lower barriers.
So that's an interesting point. So let's actually, as sort of a baseline for our discussion of this, and this may not be fair to ask you, do we have a sense for when we talk about these types of goods, whether it's vaccines and the ingredients that go into vaccines, whether it's other sort of health equipment, how integrated is the global trading system? I think people often have in mind, these are some key things, countries should be relatively self-sufficient, or some people do in any case. Do we have a good measure or a good sense of how integrated and reliant and trusting we are at the moment?
All right, so if we go to the period before the pandemic hit, let me give you what the status quo was then. We had essentially a small number of countries which were vaccine originators, developers, and then a small number of vaccine manufacturers, countries which manufacturers, and a slightly larger number of countries who are selling ingredients to vaccine to vaccine producers. And so what you have is, of the 200 trading nations around the world, less than 20 are in what you could call a vaccine producers club. That is, they produce either vaccines or the ingredients, and most produce both. And so what this has done is to create a sort of insider and outsider dynamic. If you're inside the vaccine club, you're selling, or in principle, you could sell vaccines or ship vaccines abroad, which gives your country leverage. But you're also very contingent on the goodwill of other countries to ship the vaccine ingredients to you. So the members of the club, tensions can build between them, but there's a sort of understanding that if I cut you off from access to medicines, you'll cut me off from access to ingredients, and I'll be screwed too. Now, for the countries which are outside the club, they have much less leverage. And this is, of course, what we're seeing playing out before us in a lot of the discussions about shipments to developing countries, shipments to countries, even industrialized countries that don't produce many vaccines to begin with. So take New Zealand. Until recently, Australia didn't have much either. And so countries outside the club have found themselves at a disadvantage. Now, the slide you have at the moment shows the sort of the supply chain of vaccines. If we could go to the next slide, Phil, we can show this vaccine production club idea very explicitly. Because what this diagram shows you on the left-hand side is, who are all the major exporters of vaccine ingredients, and where do they ship them to? They ship them mainly to countries which produce vaccines. So there is this this club which supplies each other with final vaccines and vaccine ingredients, where essentially there's a bit of the threat of mutually assured destruction if they go against each other. And then if you're outside this club, then you are in a much weaker position in terms of leverage. So that's the industrial organization of this sector.
So the message I'm supposed to take from this colorful loom here is that there's a lot of interdependence, at least among the members of the club.
Correct.
That while you may make one thing, you get parts for another, and so, as you say, this sort of mutually assured destruction if one were to pull out. But for the countries, as you're showing, it's a sort of very selective list of countries.
That's exactly right. And so there's, depending on how you count it, I mean, I don't think we got above 19 countries. When we put this chart together, we couldn't find more than 19 countries which were members of the club. And then, of course, some have more leverage than others. There is one subtle implication of being a member of the club, and that is that you don't overtly cut off supplies to other countries. You have to do it in a very subtle way, which is why you have the debate in the United States about whether the Defense Production Act is an export curb, which is why you have debates in the UK about whether or not the procurement practices constitute an export ban. And that's why there's a debate in the EU as to whether their scheme for reviewing export authorizations is a ban. So what happens is, inside the club, you get under the radar screen sort of beggar thy neighbor behavior, and then with respect to everyone else out in the rest of the world, they are they're at the mercy of the members of the club.
Okay, and so what have we been? How would you characterize the way sort of vaccines and health good treatment has taken place in this pandemic? We had this poll question about what ought to happen. What did happen?
So what did happen is, I think, the following. We had two countries, actually we have to differentiate between three groups of countries. We had two countries which, despite their track record of issuing industrial policy, did exactly that in the vaccine sector, and that is the United States and the United Kingdom. And as a result, they ended up investing along the entire supply chain, building up their capacity, and then stealing the march when it came to vaccinations this year. That's group one. Group two is the European Union, took a very free trade position, which was the EU has often said, look, we want to be the vaccine manufacturers to the world. And so they did not impose lots of conditions on companies to supply local markets and the like. And what they found is that once some of the vaccine suppliers got into trouble, the pressure from their populations was such that they ended up de facto restricting imports. So they started off saying we're free traders and ended up having some egg on their faces. So that's group 2. Group 3 is actually a single country, India. India is the country in the developing world which has long-standing vaccine production capacity, especially through the Serum Institute of India. And India had agreed, the Serum Institute had agreed to essentially be the supplier to the developing world. And Prime Minister Modi did what the Europeans said, which is that we will be the suppliers. You can count on us. And then when it came to March of this year, when the number of cases in India starts rising, then Modi cuts off the exports to the developing world. And in fact, yesterday, the Serum Institute of India announced that they will not be resuming exports to developing countries until the end of the year. And so we can put the facts on the table, Phil, if we can go to the next slide, what we have is on slide 21 is a chart which shows, do you have that?
Yes.
Great. So if we can go to slide 21.
It should be there, but
okay. Well, this is a chart which shows how on the left-hand side, the monthly exports from India collapse. Sorry, the weekly exports from India collapsed in the beginning of March and have never resumed. And then in a piece of analysis I did with Matt Lineley from Airfinity, we using the delivery data and contracts that we knew about, we then asked how much would this put back the inoculation efforts of countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And in the case of Africa, we saw that the Indian move of stopping shipments would put back inoculation by about 2 to 3 months. So you can see how once India cuts off exports and stops being the vaccine supplier to the developing world, then there's this huge knock-on effects, which is just another way of saying being outside the vaccine production club has a price, and that's exactly why governments are now debating whether they should have more domestic vaccine production capacity. And that is implicit in that viewpoint is what some of your participants were highlighting, which is that they think that when it push comes to shove, vaccines and medical goods are different.
Well, and so let's close on that point and let me push it a little bit. Looking at this experience that you just described, and you described very well, do you see this as sui generis, or do you see this as the kind of thing where people are going to draw broader conclusions of, can I trust the trading system, or do I need to be self-sufficient? Will they think that's just health, no spillovers? Or will we start seeing, look, if that was true for health, it's also true for food, it's true for cars, it's true for other things?
It's a great question. And I think the policymakers that I've listened to, they do fall into some camps. Some argue that this is a very special sector. It may need treatment as some type of policy response. And others politicians are ones who are always against supply chains, and they were against globalization. And this is for them a huge opportunity to unravel as much of that as they can. And this is the fight that is going on in just about every Western capital that I know about. Now, I think one of the things a key thing to look for, and we saw it last year too, is how quickly can the private sector ramp up production. Last year, there was policymakers freaked out about the scarcity of masks in Q2. But by the time we get to Q3 and Q4, the world is flooded with masks, ironically, many of them made in China. And so this put an end to the mask shortage hysteria. This year in Q2, we have hysteria about vaccines. Yet the production estimates, ramp-up estimates that I have seen strongly suggest that when we get into Q3 and Q4 of this year, then we will probably have met a lot of the demand, global demand, for first-round vaccinations, the first pair of shots of vaccinations for people. So we could end up concluding, if that's the case, that we have, we're currently going through a bout of second quarter madness. And if only we could hold our nerve by the end of the year, we might look at these issues very differently. And that might alter the political debate you started with many politicians saying, hey, look, shortages happen. What matters is the speed of the private sector response and keeping trade flowing so that production ramp up gets distributed across the world as quickly as possible and the shortages get eliminated.
So your point about Madison hysteria is an excellent lead into our final poll question. We don't want to shortchange the future, and we've got so much good stuff to talk about that our time is running short. But let me ask the audience, how hysterical do you feel and how hysterical do you expect to be in the future? No, we're not going to pose it that way. What we're going to say is, as we hopefully move beyond the worst of the COVID-19 crisis, do you expect global protection? And here are your choices. Will stay pretty much as it has been. This wasn't about the pandemic. Will subside. That would be Simon's, retreating hysteria argument. Will increase. That's the trend. Will shift. There will still be fights, but they may be on different goods and services, so sort of a reallocation. Or the future is hard to predict. I'll leave that to the quote-unquote experts, which is the easy opt-out that we sometimes like to offer you just to be nice. So closing up here, we're going to talk about the future in the few minutes we have remaining. But how do you see things developing? What's your best guess at the moment? That to the extent we are, and hopefully we are moving to a post-COVID world, what is that going to mean for protection? That stay the same, subside, increase, shift around, or who knows? We've got some good answers. Let me ask you to place your bets. No, we don't encourage wagering. And it's hard to collect anyways. But make your best guesses, and we will show, and then we'll ask Simon to reveal to us what the future will be like. So going once, going twice, you all think... Okay, that we're basically going to, the majority said that global protection is just going to shift. There are going to be fights, but it's going to be on different things. It's going to shift around. With the number two answer being that they took your early charts to heart, which was this wasn't necessarily the trend has been the things that protection was increasing, and this we have a meager 5% of raving optimists who say global protection will subside. Simon, where are you on the optimism, madness, hysteria index?
So I want to emphasize two things, right? I think, at least I hope, based on what we've seen on the production ramp-up numbers, that the hysteria in vaccines will go away. But who knows when the next outbreak of hysteria will come from? There'll be a shortage maybe in semiconductors or something else. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that there could be outbursts of hysteria from time to time. And given the data I showed you earlier, I'm also sympathetic to the idea that there is some trend shift towards especially subsidization, which is just underway. And that trend dynamic may not change because of the pandemic at all. So you can imagine having a trend shift towards a more subsidy-distorted trading system with, on top of it, occasional outbursts of hysteria. So that's your shifting argument. So maybe a combination of the two most popular responses is probably the right prediction.
So we're not going to have time to do justice to all the good work you've done on digital trade and the like, but we do have a minute or so for you to sort of, people can read what you write, and they should read what you write. What do you see as the big things to watch in trade protection in the next minute or so? What's on the horizon?
So let me just quickly dwell on the digital point, which is we started tracking for this year policy changes which are affecting digital commerce because we sensed that they were picking up. And that has proved to be the case. We've seen a huge acceleration this year in the number of policy interventions by the big players around different aspects of the digital economy. And there's a real risk here that the digital economy will begin to fragment globally. And this has important implications for any business model which is based on scale and on the acquisition of information and data by scale or through scale. So I think that's a really big area to watch going forward. And then I think the other big area to watch is what you hinted at earlier, Phil. What will our political leaders draw as lessons from the pandemic era? Is it that we need to hold our nerve, these shortages happen, the private sector ultimately delivers, and so it's a matter of managing that? Or is the conclusion that we simply cannot trust trading partners anymore and we must build more stuff at home, in which case expect to see a lot more subsidies and tariffs?
Well, thank you for both your insight and your concision. I will sort of make the point to everyone out there, among beyond his clarity, one of the great things that Simon does, he's prolific. He puts out the global trade alerts and quite a number of reports, and they are, unlike many economists, and I say this as a card-carrying one, they're readable and accessible, and as you have seen, they're on topic. So, Simon, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your wisdom. To the audience, an on-demand version of this webinar will be available shortly after we conclude. It can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. We invite you to save your spot for the next webinar. You'll find that link on the top right. And we thank you for joining us today, and please do stay safe. With that, we conclude.